Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank my friend Yusuf and the WTI for putting this together on a short notice. I know they have a very busy schedule, so but we wanted to take advantage of our friend Seth being in town and hear more of his insights of what's happening in our region, more specifically in Rojava and Bashur. And so Seth, all of you know Seth, and we've been following his work for a number of years, especially when it comes to covering the war on ISIS and the Kurdish struggle and the fight against that terror group. Seth and I have known each other since 2012, I believe. For many years, I've admired his work because he's an insider. He's based in Jerusalem. And he has many contacts throughout the region, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq and Rojava and many other places in the region. So his perspective on what's happening in Kurdistan, especially in Syria and Iraq, is always unique, and that is always manifested in his work. Now, instead of an introduction, I would like to start with Seth's book. Seth wrote this book last year. It's called After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. Now, most of the stuff, unfortunately, that Seth predicted in this book came true, including the U.S. and Iranian struggle, as the subtitle suggests, for control and influence in the Middle East. Both countries have been, since the physical defeat of ISIS, both countries have been vying for control, especially in Syria and Iraq, and I think it was particularly manifested in the targeted killing, the U.S. killing of Qasem Soleimani a couple months ago, and how things started to unfold in a different kind of unexpected direction. So, Seth, I'd like to start with that and put it and kind of tie it to how the whole U.S.-Iranian tensions in the past few years, basically since the start of war on ISIS, has impacted the Kurdish regions in general and Syria and Iraq in particular.
So you'd like me to start more with the Iranian issue?
Sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I first started going to Iraqi Kurdistan, to the Erbil, I think that was in 2015. So imagine back then, it was during the height of the war on ISIS, actually the spring of 2015. So it was after the worst days in August of 2014, but ISIS was still very, very powerful. They had taken Ramadi, and they were very close to Baghdad. And they had this long front line that was stretching all the way from, in terms of the Kurdish region, all the way from Kirkuk all the way up to, they still controlled areas of Sinjar. And then obviously in Syria, in 2015, it was still the era just after Kobani, the Battle of Kobani had been ended, but then it was unclear what was going to come next. So when I arrived there, the degree of Iranian influence, or the question of what would Iran's role be, I think it's so fundamentally different than what we see today. At the time, ISIS and extremism was the big thing. It's 2015, I think, was a very crucial year because it was the same year as the Iran deal, the same year also as the Russians entered into Syria. It was the same year, I think, that you had the creation, of course, of the SDF. So you had a whole series of things taking place that year. Also, the degree to which the popular mobilization units, the Hajj al-Shabi, they had been raised, of course, in 2014. But imagine how quickly the PMU, or Hajj al-Shabi, became part of the Iraqi state apparatus. So that already by 2016, 2017, there was a discussion about making them officially part of the government. And that's a massive acceleration in terms of, let's say, Iran's power influence, to go from having a network of paramilitary militia groups, of which there are 100,000 people, to having actually an official part of the government's security framework. That's something, by the way, that Hezbollah was never able to achieve. Hezbollah started out as, whatever you want to call it, a terrorist or resistance movement in the 80s, right? Obviously very close to Iran. But Hezbollah never achieved a status, an official status. It's not even in parliament today. Of course, it has some representatives, right? But it doesn't. It has a minister who's influenced by Hezbollah. Whereas when you look at the Iranian influence in Iraq, I mean, the slow process by which Iran has gained that influence on the political level and the military level, the interior ministry, maybe businesses. I'm not such an expert on the Iranian influence in the economy, but must be quite large. So when I kept going back to Iraq again and again after 2015, and each time I went back, especially in the Kurdish region, the concerns about what is going to happen next in terms of Iran's role in Iraq, and obviously the U.S. role, because I think generally, at least especially in Erbil, this question of this dichotomy between a kind of rising Iran and the question marks about what's going to happen with the U.S. Will the U.S. stay? Will they continue to fund the Peshmerga training? Will they help to balance Iran? And so when I was there, I think I went in 2016, I was down in Kirkuk, and I was with some members of this Iranian exile group, or a group called the PAK, they had Peshmerga, but they were Iranians. They said, listen, when the war against ISIS is over, and actually they turned out to be correct, there will be a war against this PMU, the militias. And they said that there will be a conflict over Kirkuk, which actually ended up happening, of course, in October of 2017. There was, I think, when I went back in 2017, prior to the referendum, I went back in 2016, 2017 to cover the Battle of Mosul. And I remember driving from Erbil. You had to get to Mosul, you had to drive out towards where is Hamdani or Karakosh. I don't know if anyone knows it, but it's a large Christian town in Nineveh Plains. So you go out there, you actually go past some of these Kakai villages called next to Wardak, villages that had been destroyed by ISIS, and into Nineveh Plains. And then you take a left-hand turn instead of going straight into what is then would be eastern Mosul. You want to cross the river. So when you leave the Kurdistan region, or where the last Kurdish flag is, you immediately enter at all of this kind of salad of different types of basically PMU or Hajj al-Shabi or pro-Iranian flags. So you leave the Kurdish flag behind. You don't see the Iraqi flag. You get into a checkpoint with Kateb Hezbollah, Badr, or in this case, sometimes you had some Christian units, so it's the NPU, and then you get into an area that's controlled by the Hajj al-Shebek. But a whole network of groups that are all aligned somehow with the PMU and therefore Iran. So it was fascinating to just see it physically. Like, we went through 20 checkpoints. And then you finally get to Western Mosul, where you have federal police, the Iraqi government. And then you see Iraqi flags. Then you see the Iraqi government. But it was immediately clear the way in which Iran or pro-Iranian groups were trying to grab hold of real estate with their armed units, and armed units that have a political part as well. So I think that when we think about the way in which Iran is trying to kind of influence the region but kind of sink itself into the soil a bit, it's very important to understand the kind of long-term investment. And one thing, I have a quote in the book towards the end where someone said that, how does the Iranians and the Russians and the Americans look differently at like a project that they're working on? And it says, well, the Americans will want a status report in like a month, whereas the Russians will be like, okay, give us a status report in 6 months. And the Iranians will say, give us a status report in 10 years. So I felt, I was seeing in person this kind of 10-year project. I think most people in other parts of Iraq have said, yeah, but the project began 30 years ago. I mean, whether if you were in Basra or Baghdad, but I was in Kirkuk and Nineveh and Mosul. But, everyone I spoke to was very, very concerned about, the degree to which that Iranian project would continue. And also I think there were several layers of concerns, because from the Kurdish regions, I think question was, if you have too many Iranian militias on the borders, the reaction is more ISIS, like it's a cycle. If you crush the dreams or the abilities of any of the Sunnis to have some role, you eventually will have a reaction. So I think even before the rise of ISIS, many people in the Kurdistan region had predicted that something is going to come out of there. And in terms of Syria, which of course forms another side of this, I mean, I think from what I understand, there was not a lot of Iranian influence in eastern Syria, but there is today, of course, the question that Iran would like very much to remove U.S. forces from Iraq and Syria. And they would like to find a way to do that peacefully, because I think that currently Iran is very, very concerned about the Trump administration willingness to kill people. The Trump administration seems to have put a red line along the concept that you cannot kill Americans. So if you look at the rocket attacks in Iraq in the last, let's say the last year, they started or they increased, especially in May and June when the tensions increased with Iran. And then especially in October, November, December last year, this rocket attacks against U.S. forces, right, which eventually resulted in the killing of one American in next to K1, next to Kirkuk. And then the Americans retaliated by attacking like 5 Kataib Hezbollah sites. And this has created this cycle. So, you know, we are at a kind of moment now of which I think there's a big question then about where this all goes.
Okay, so that was interesting because I want to tie into that by zooming into again both Kurdish regions in Syria and Iraq. Now, at some point during the war on ISIS, everyone thought that Kurds probably have become the ultimate winners of this war on ISIS, and you know, in Syria, Kurds managed to carve out some sort of political autonomy. At some point, expanding their area of controls to non-Kurdish territory, especially in eastern Syria. And you'd like to call it eastern Syria more often. We had this debate before, as opposed to northeast Syria. And but then in October 2017 and October 2019, we have something with October, I guess, right? We realized how fragile Kurds could be at a time when everyone thought that, okay, you know, Kurdistan regional government is getting more and more autonomous from the rest of Iraq. Their relations were not at best with Abadi, and same thing with Syria. Damascus was losing control of much territory in eastern Syria, as opposed to the SDF and the YPG expanding their territories. Oppositions making inroads in part of northwest Syria, it being Idlib. And but then it all disappeared with the Kurdish referendum in October 2017, and then ultimately in the Turkish invasion of Rojava in 2019. Where do you see the situation, progress moving forward? I mean, the fact that Kurds still trying to convince Western intelligence officials that the ISIS is still around. ISIS could probably resurge at some point. Where do you see the whole, not just the war on ISIS, but also the local Kurdish dynamics, and how that will play out into the broader picture of the region?
I would go back again to 2015, which I think is a kind of interesting crux year. Because 2015 is the same year of that the SDF was founded. It's the same year, by the way, that the PKK Turkish government ceasefire broke down. It's also the same year, as I said, that because of the rise of ISIS, the Kurdistan region of Iraq was largely isolated, actually cut off from Baghdad. So actually, if we go back to 2015, there is a high point in some ways of Kurdish power. You have the Kurdistan regional government is basically a state because it's so isolated from Baghdad. It has to behave basically like a country. So it has its own armed forces, airports. Of course, eventually it will receive more and more funding and support from the coalition. And the SDF is created. The SDF will eventually liberate Raqqa in 2017. And the ceasefire breaks down in Turkey, which has the long-term effect, I think, of not only the brutal conflict that results in 2016 in Turkey, but eventually results then in, as we all recall, the Turkish decision to go into Jarablus after Manbij was liberated in 2016, right? Remember that the Turkish government was very reticent to go into Syria. In fact, ironically, today there is the fight in Idlib, but when the Syrians were begging the Turks, please come in to help us in Aleppo in 2016, it didn't happen. So actually, the Turkish government, their their fear or their whatever you want to, their excuse about the claims that there is some huge threat from Syria, led them systematically to go into Jarablus with this Operation Euphrates Shield, then into Afrin in 2018, then 2019, of course, into Tel Aviv. So I think it's interesting. From 2015, you have a kind of interesting crux moment, and then a high point of Kurdish power, which is in 2017. And then from the referendum, you have a series of kind of roadblocks or setbacks that happen to the Kurdish regions. Like, of course, the closure of the airports is a disaster, but also the conquest of Kirkuk and Sinjar. So I think that, of course, the airports were reopened and the Kurdistan region's economy is good today. And actually, if you look at today, Masroor Barzani's globetrotting and meetings in many countries and with officials, I mean, Kurdistan region is doing very well, actually. But in terms of what happened, I think in October 2019, with the American decision to withdraw from part of eastern Syria, northeast Syria. Yeah. Let's remember, Donald Trump said in the spring of 2017, we are leaving Syria. It's not true, by the way, that Donald Trump suddenly woke up one morning in October of 2019 and decided to leave. He didn't. He wanted to leave in the spring of 2017. Remember, in the fall of 2018, there was a lot of pressure on the United States by Turkey. And remember, Donald Trump spoke to Erdogan and said, I'm leaving in December 2018. Then he flew to Iraq, actually, and he had this very strange statement where he said to the troops, don't worry, we're leaving. We're going to watch Iran from Iraq, and if ISIS comes back, we'll hit them from here. And all of a sudden, the Iraqis are saying, what, are you crazy? You can't use Iraq to watch Iran. Didn't matter. And then he walked that back. Pompeo and Bolton, or whoever, walked it back. But remember, at the same time, Jim Jeffrey was telling the Turks and saying openly that the relationship with the YPG or SDF is what he called a temporary, transactional, and it was very clear. He said temporary, transactional, tactical, three things. Temporary is quite clear, temporary. Transactional means if you take Raqqa, we give you guns. You take Baghouz, we give you more. Okay, it's done. So tactical, what does tactical mean? Obviously, it's not a strategic relationship. It's what the Americans call by, with, and through. By, with, and through is we work with you and by you and through you. You do all the work, then we leave. It's not a very nice thing if you're the person on the other side of that deal. But I mean, in a sense, the Americans were saying this is a deal. Now, CENTCOM was not saying that. CENTCOM was telling the same SDF, no, we're here for 10 years. We're going to do stabilization. Well, stabilization is a 10 or 20-year process. You could be there forever. I mean, what is Afghanistan? Afghanistan has 20 years of 18 years of stabilization. Now the Americans are leaving. But I think the message was sent, whether or not the SDF wanted to accept the message or whether or not, but the American officials of the State Department was telling them it's not going to happen. CENTCOM was saying, no, but we'd like to stay. Well, the question is, who do you believe, the CENTCOM or the State Department? Right. I mean, actually, you have to believe who's at the top. It's Donald Trump. But I think that, we've seen the setbacks. Now, it's not that the Kurdish regions are destroyed. The Kurdistan region of Iraq has had a setback. Is it worse off than in 2008 or 2009 under Maliki? I don't know. Maliki was very tough on the Kurdish region. It seems that Sadr and Badr and all the groups now in Baghdad are also trying to pressure the Kurdistan region again. But look, the region itself is flourishing. And actually, there's a lot of sympathy now, again, in Washington for the Kurdistan region of Iraq because everyone understands that the rest of Iraq is again falling into an Iranian-occupied state. So there is discussions, or maybe there should be more discussions about the bilateral agreements with the Peshmerga for security assistance. And I think that many people, it's interesting how it works here, tend to be that people that support the SDF were also pro-Iran deal people, and they are seen by the current administration somehow as pro-Iran. So therefore, I've heard this by his way said, that there are the good Kurds and the bad Kurds, and that the good Kurds are in Iraq, and the bad Kurds are like the SDF, what they say, PKK or whatever. So this idea that, we should work with Iraq, but not this, it's fine. Some people think that way. The point is, though, that I think it's not all lost because there is a deep investment in keeping ISIS defeated in eastern Syria. Many people have an interest in keeping U.S. forces there, not just the Kurdish groups.
Right.
There are other regional actors that care about Eastern Syria and not having Iran and Russia run in. Because if the U.S. withdraws, someone comes in, and that will be Iran and Russia. So everyone understands that. And I think that's why, both these Kurdish regions, which are very different and have different leaderships and what have you, they both have a lot to say in terms of what comes next. And I think there is a lot of sympathy. There is a huge amount of overall sympathy in general for Kurds. Once people start getting into the differences of this or that, there's differences. But, there is a lot to do here. And I think, by the way, the United States today, I sense, has a fatigue for conflicts like Afghanistan. Everyone says, I don't want to hear about Afghanistan. Because, look, if you were born on 9/11, you're old enough to serve in Afghanistan. Americans are rightly fatigued about conflict. But there's one thing they're not fatigued about. Most Americans, I think, or some of them, agree with Donald Trump's feeling, listen, let those other people fight. But many people have sympathy for the Kurds as a group. There's almost no other group in the world, I don't think, that the average American has sympathy for as much as the Kurdish people. I mean, of course, they're pro-Israel. There are other group they like England, but they don't have sympathy for the English. So that's a positive thing.
But going back to Syria, don't you think the mission has changed ever since the U.S. withdrawal in October 2019? I mean, Brett McGurk, the former U.S. presidential envoy to the coalition, said that the mission started to defeat ISIS, but then it evolved to include curbing Iranian expansion in the region.
Right.
Don't you think that disappeared with the partial U.S. withdrawal from parts of Syria?
Well, look, that's the very interesting question. If the mission was just to defeat ISIS, then Jeffrey was kind of correct in saying it's a temporary transactional relationship. ISIS is defeated. I mean, it basically is defeated. However, you know what's happening in Eastern Syria. The Americans realize that even though ISIS is defeated, there are like 10,000 ISIS detainees and like 80,000 members of their families. So the Americans, cynically today, are in some ways basically trying to get the Kurdish region, or whatever, the SDF region, to basically be the jailers. They're basically subcontractors. That's not a good position to be in. That basically the only reason we support you is because you're a subcontractor to keep ISIS in a pen. It's ridiculous. The international community should be doing more with that. But let's say that the mission shifted from defeating ISIS, okay, check mark, done, to mission creep, which is, oh, wait a sec, we now own this region, and now we can use it to block Iran. Actually, that's a good thing for that region, because if you're all of a sudden, if in the end of the day you have to be kind of a tool of the American role there, because the SDF doesn't have a way to work with other countries or balance that, and if they've decided basically that to put all their eggs in one basket with the U.S., then being a tool in a sense of being a placeholder to keep Iranian influence out, it keeps the United States there, as opposed to the ISIS conflict, which is primarily over. I think the stabilization aspect is the one that actually would have been best for the Eastern Syria, but I think the stabilization aspect is totally off the table, because the Trump administration's view is laser focused on, Trump always says, I think, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And if the generals say, well, we're there to stabilize, stabilization sounds like a waste of money. It sounds like Afghanistan. It sounds like a sunk cost. And if you're Donald Trump and you think in terms of business, it's a sunk cost. It's a waste. Let's leave. So if you say, no, but we're going to block Iran, it's good for Israel, we can block the Iranians, we can do this or that, it's not a chaos, we don't want ISIS to come back, we have all the detainees. The oil is very important, apparently, even though there's not much oil. But, okay, so you have an excuse to stay. I mean, I think that's the realities. And if you say, well, you have to work within the realities, then that's the place to work, unless the decision is, well, to just work with other countries in the world that are not the United States in terms of what's going to happen there. But I think that's the if the mission creep is to prevent Iran, then the United States has to stay, because if every American soldier that leaves is certainly going to be an exponential increase in American influence at some point.
Okay, one more question, and then maybe we can open it to questions. I guess one thing that Kurds always ask is, like, Americans take us for granted. And I talked to a lot of Kurdish officials, especially in Syria, and the question that always comes to mind is, like, what should we do to stop that perception in Washington? And to a certain degree, they're right? I mean, whatever that is done, that's been done to the Kurds, whether it was the Iraqi Kurdish referendum or the U.S. withdrawal from parts of eastern Syria. Kurds have managed to keep their relationship with the United States. But what advice do you have for the Kurds moving forward in terms of managing, keeping this partnership with the U.S., but also protecting their interest in with keeping in mind with all these changes in the region?
Well, I think there needs to be a bit of honesty about where the United States is going in the future. I mean, the United States is involved in its own deep political crisis. It's also involved in a fundamental change in its own question of what its role in the world is. In the 1990s, the United States set out to kind of remake the world as this 1,000 points of light or New World Order of George Bush Sr. And as you probably recall, the United States went into Iraq and then went into a whole bunch of other countries. There was the Haiti, Panama, Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo. You just named the endless list. The America was this global policeman and involved in state building. By the time you get to George W. Bush and the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, there is a view that is not going to work. There's not going to be a democratic spring. It's not going to happen. We're not good at state building. Let's just leave. And I think that the United States is in a long-term arc of trying to reduce forces. And insofar as it keeps forces, it wants to confront the Russians or the Chinese. It wants to do big state competition. Because everyone thinks that the Chinese are building aircraft carriers too quickly, and that's where your problems are. The global war on terror, which began on 9/11, has largely also become something that people feel is either over or is a failure. So counterterrorism strategy, which was something that everyone loved in 2004, 5, 6, Cohen and all this, it seems like the general perception is it's not our job in the United States to do counterterrorism everywhere. We already are doing it in 80 countries. We already have almost 80,000 members of the SOCOM Special Forces basically doing this. So we've reached a peak. It's enough. I think in terms of the Kurdish region then, Kurds need to be a bit, honest, maybe honest with themselves, which is the sense that, look, America is an ally of the Kurds. It has empathy and sympathy for them. There is a special relationship. It's not a special relationship between like the U.S. and England or the U.S. and Israel or something, but there's a relationship. I mean, let's be honest. The United States doesn't care about the Rohingya or the Uyghurs, and that's lots of people. It does care about the Kurds a lot. It doesn't manifest itself in the correct policies, unfortunately. But I think that Kurds, of course, should make sure that they put their own interests first. So I would argue that they should never put the United States. They should not put the United States' interests first. I mean, the United States is a partner, and I think the United States should be seen for what it is, which is, if the United States tells you it's a temporary transactional relationship, then you should say, okay, our relationship is also temporary and transactional. So for every rifle you give us, we'll go 500 feet forward. Like, I just think that rather than pretend it's something it's not. But if the United States wants to do bilateral relationships and work with the Kurdistan region of Iraq in terms of trade deals or certain things, then great. So that should be the relationship, and I think actually it is a good relationship with Erbil. So, but I think Ronald Reagan said something he called trust but verify. So if the Kurds trust the Americans, but they should verify that as well. I think that I would give an example with the SDF as an example. So the STF was receiving support and training, but as far as I can understand it, they did not receive a lot of official visits from the State Department or Washington. It was as if they were treated, I don't want to say this is crude, but they were treated sometimes like a mistress. And I think if you're being treated that way, and no one at the State Department will meet with you officially publicly, but they only do it clandestinely, then you have to be a bit honest about where that is going. But I think that certainly Mike Pence and people, they meet the heads of the Kurdistan region. So the degree to which you have to receive something. Now, what's happened in eastern Syria or what's happened in northern Iraq, that's water under the bridge. We can't go back to October 2017, October 2019. We can't go back and replay the referendum. Like, people say, oh, it was a mistake, it wasn't a mistake. It happened. It's done. We can't go back and decide what should have happened in Raqqa, or like, well, maybe the SDF shouldn't have taken Raqqa or this. Or, it's over. The question is what can be done into the future. I think that there is a lot of sympathy for what's happened in eastern Syria. A lot of people understand that the Kurds sacrificed huge numbers of lives. And insofar as there can be work done to keep the U.S. presence or keep other presence or lobby for some sort of federal structure or even I think there's no reason for Kurds not to hedge their work. They're not a colony of the United States. There's no reason not to hedge their discussions with other countries like India, China, Russia, any country in the region. Of course, in the SDF's case, they cannot speak to Turkey, but they can speak to Russia and Iran, I guess. I mean, not to compete against the Americans or harm the U.S., but there's no reason that they should not speak to whoever they can speak to. They can speak to Azerbaijan. There are other countries in the world, or the Czech Republic, or Hungary, by the way. Hungary supports the Peshmerga. Mm-hmm. Why not? There's lots of people in Eastern Europe. The Kurdistan region is a small region. Why not work with other small countries that maybe have some interest in playing some minor role there? And I don't see any reason that those countries, by the way, many of them have been very good for Israel, for instance, Eastern European countries. And probably they have some interest in the Kurdish region because they have a shared history of the Ottoman Empire. So why not to work with those places? They are small places. Okay, it's not big America. But they have some role to play. And look, the future is going to be a future that is more about India and China and Eastern Europe and Russia and Turkey and Iran. And that's just the reality. The world is becoming a multipolar world. Everyone understands that. So that's the realities.
Yeah, I said last question, but I have one last, and then we'll open it to questions. I guess you come from Israel, and you see people talk about the Kurdish cause in general. It's different from what you hear from the American public. But do you think the Israelis have any interest in? I mean, there was rhetorical support from Prime Minister Netanyahu during the Kurdish referendum in Iraq, but do you think Israel should be more interested in forging new alliances with different Kurdish groups, depend on where they come from, especially in Syria, given that?
Well, I think the question with Israel is not always whether or not Israel would like the relationship. It's whether the Kurds would like to have an open relationship, because, of course, it causes them sometimes political trouble. Like, if someone in Kurdistan region, an official, for instance, would meet an Israeli official, then there will be, of course, some huge, gossip in Baghdad and some newspaper reports. So, I think that actually it's the Kurdistan region that has to hedge a bit sometimes thought about that. It doesn't always help to openly, hang out with the Israelis. Maybe it helps to hang out with the Israelis in a form in which other countries in the region are doing that. I mean, Turkey has relations with Israel. The Gulf states do not have relations with Israel, but there is apparently a consensus that Israel-Gulf relations are getting better. India has relations with Israel. So, there's no reason that there cannot be a meeting when all of them are at Davos or something. I mean, there is everyone just together anyway. Yeah. But I think that, it's a question of the Kurdistan region. I think Israel has a lot of sympathy for the Kurds. It's the only country in the world that has a lot of open public sympathy from the Prime Minister's office. And people speak frequently about it. It's a country, by the way, as far as I recall, the only country in the world in October 2019 that said that they will give humanitarian aid to people who are fleeing. No one else cared when there was people were fleeing from the attacks. And Israel, they said openly, publicly, that aid was given. So that's a fact. Israel, by the way, has even been in touch about the issue of the coronavirus issue, and if there is some medical necessity or medical training that can be done online, is there expertise that can be provided? So, I mean, I think that's a relationship or discussion that is there. I mean, I think that, again, the question is whether the Kurdistan region benefits from that, because the Kurdistan region is close to Iran, so it may not be a necessary public relationship, but in terms of sympathy in the region, Israel's in the region, and other countries in the region are already. There are lots of countries that work with Israel. Jordan works with Israel. I think that Masroor Barzani was just in Jordan. Yeah. So this is a fact of life. All those countries are part of the region.
But in the Syrian context, do you think? Israel borders Syria.
Yeah,
and do you think, in that context, do you think Israel should be more interested in Syrian Kurds as opposed to Kurds in general and being sympathetic to the Kurds?
I think that Israel is interested in Americans staying in Syria. I think Israel does not want the Iranians running into Tanf, or by the way, the Iranians already have a base in Abu Kamal. They don't need more bases. So I think the Americans have, Israel has an interest in having them there, and insofar as that's a shared interest with the Kurds in eastern Syria. It's a shared interest. There's a shared interest in having American power, American influence, America's role. I mean, Israel is an American ally, and the countries, by the way, in the Middle East that are U.S. allies tend to also be relatively close to some degree with Kurdish when it comes to Kurdish issues. So this already exists, this kind of mutual understanding, I think, of shared interests, and the idea that having too much Iranian power in eastern Syria is not helpful, certainly for Israel's interest of the U.S. or others.
All right, thank you. Now we'll open it to Q&A. So if you have any questions, I'm sure you do. All right.